Los Ranchos, Albuquerque, Wentworth Children's Hell OMG. The Babysitter is Possessed. Chapter 1. The move to Albuquerque. The sun cast a warm glow over Albuquerque, bathing the serene streets of Los Ranchos in a golden hue. Trees whispered in the mild breeze, their leaves rustling like an old vinyl record. It was the kind of neighborhood where children laughed openly, doors remained unlocked, and community meant everything. But that sunny afternoon, an unfamiliar moving van disrupted the peace, rumbling onto Rio Grande Boulevard. At the helm of that van was Cassie, her piercing blue eyes scanning the new environment. Her lips curved into a small, enigmatic smile. The 17-year-old was striking, with raven black hair cascading down her shoulders, contrasting her fair skin. From a distance, she appeared like any teenager, filled with dreams, apprehensions, and that tinge of rebellion. But there was something unsettlingly different about Cassie. It was in her gaze, a coldness, a void. Her family's new home was a classic Santa Fe-style adobe, sprawling over a considerable acreage. It stood out, not because of its grandeur but because it had been vacant for years. Whispers circulated about the previous occupants' unexplained disappearance, but over time, like every other tale, it had been forgotten. As her family began unloading boxes, Cassie's younger brother, Jake, tugged at her sleeve, pointing excitedly to a treehouse in the backyard. It seemed worn out, its wood weathered and gray. Cassie patted his head, her fingers lingering for a moment too long, making Jake shiver involuntarily. School was a new beginning. Cassie, ever adaptable, seemed to fit right in. She quickly became part of the popular clique, her mysterious aura drawing people in. But there was always an unmistakable distance, a barrier people couldn't breach. In the first week, while her classmates were engrossed in algebra, Cassie sketched a flyer, Experienced Babysitter. Reliable and fun. Contact Cassie. She would later pin this on the local community park's bulletin board. The park, with its majestic cottonwoods, was where parents often spent their evenings, watching their children play. One evening, as the sun prepared to dip below the horizon, a soft-spoken woman named Francine Wentworth paused to read the flyer. The name, Cassie, rang a bell. Ah, yes, the new girl. Francine was the archetype of elegance, her auburn hair always neatly tied back, her clothes meticulously chosen. A loving mother of 3, she was constantly on the lookout for trustworthy sitters. That night, over dinner, she discussed the possibility of hiring Cassie with her husband, Thomas. Their 3 children, Luigi with his innocent hazel eyes, Samara, the dreamy-eyed artist, and Franklin, the ever-rebellious teen, had varying needs. Finding the right babysitter was no mean feat. Thomas, ever the cautious one, frowned. "Isn't she the one from that family that moved into the old Richardson place?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Francine waved him off. "Rumors, Tom. Just rumors. Besides, Sarah from the book club says she's lovely." Later, as Francine readied herself for bed, she found herself watching her children from the hallway, Luigi with his toy cars, Samara sketching on her pad, and Franklin, earphones in, lost in his music. They were her world. And soon, they would be under Cassie's watch. The next morning, as birds tweeted and the world began its daily hustle, Cassie found a note pinned to her flyer. Francine's neat handwriting inquired about her availability. Cassie's eyes glittered as she read, a smirk playing on her lips. Unbeknownst to the Wentworth family, they had just invited an enigma into their home, a puzzle that might never be solved. As Cassie walked back home, she crossed paths with an old woman who froze mid-step, her pale eyes widening in alarm. She muttered a quick prayer and hurried away, leaving Cassie chuckling softly to herself. And so, the story began. The calm waters of Los Ranchos were about to be disturbed, and ripples of a haunting tale would soon spread, changing the town's narrative forever. Chapter 2. First impressions. The old grandfather clock in the Wentworth living room chimed 4 o'clock as Cassie walked up the cobblestone path to their front door. She took a moment to admire the house, a sprawling manor of brick and wood, with ivy crawling up its sides. The windows, though clean, seemed to hold a century of secrets behind them. She could see Luigi and Samara peering curiously from behind the drapes. Francine opened the door with a welcoming smile, her presence exuding warmth. "You must be Cassie," she said, extending her hand. Cassie took it, her grip firm. "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Wentworth." The initial introduction was standard. Cassie was led into the living room, where the children sat apprehensively. Samara fiddled with her sketchbook, Luigi clutched a toy car, and Franklin, the oldest, was visibly disinterested, his eyes fixed on his phone. "Kids, this is Cassie. She'll be looking after you tonight," Francine said, trying to instill some excitement. Cassie knelt down to Luigi's level. "Hey there, champ," she greeted, her voice soft. "Is that a race car?" Luigi, usually shy, warmed to her immediately. "Yeah. It's Lightning McQueen." Samara, without lifting her gaze from her drawing, added, "He's obsessed with it." Cassie chuckled, moving to sit beside the young artist. "What are you drawing?" Samara hesitated for a moment before showing her a pencil sketch of the house, but with exaggerated, Gothic elements, elongated windows, haunting shadows, and a distorted moon. Cassie's eyes gleamed with genuine interest. "It's beautiful, but a tad eerie." Samara blushed. "I love Gothic art." Franklin grunted from his corner, not even bothering to look up. Cassie took it in stride. Teenagers were always a challenge. Dinner was a simple affair, with Cassie seamlessly blending into the family dynamic. She assisted Francine in the kitchen, set the table, and even managed to get Franklin to utter a couple of sentences. As night began its descent, casting long shadows across the floors and walls, Thomas and Francine prepared to leave for their event. They reiterated some house rules, gave Cassie emergency numbers, and, with a final round of hugs and a stern reminder from Thomas to Franklin to behave, they left. Cassie watched the car disappear down the lane before turning to face her charges. The atmosphere shifted palpably. The weight of the impending night was evident in the silence that blanketed the house. The initial couple of hours went by without incident. Cassie played board games with Luigi and Samara, and even got Franklin to join for a round of Monopoly. But as they settled down to watch a movie, things began to change. The first sign was subtle. A whisper. Almost like the wind was trying to communicate. Cassie noticed Samara's grip tighten around her sketchbook. Luigi, snuggled under a blanket, asked with a quiver in his voice, "Did anyone hear that?" Franklin scoffed, "It's just the wind." But then came the softest of lullabies, echoing through the house, chilling to the bone. It was a woman's voice, sweet yet sorrowful. The notes rose and fell, words unintelligible. Cassie's expression remained unchanged, but there was a hint of something in her eyes, an acknowledgement. Samara clutched Luigi, her face white. "That's not the wind, Frankie." Franklin frowned, a trace of worry crossing his features. He got up, trying to locate the source. As he moved towards the hallway, the temperature dropped. A cold gust blew in, extinguishing the candles. "Very funny, Cassie," he sneered, trying to sound brave. "You can cut the act now." But Cassie was still seated, her face an unreadable mask. "It wasn't me," she whispered. The lullaby grew louder, more haunting. The house seemed to come alive, groaning under some unseen pressure. Shadows danced on the walls, taking grotesque shapes, mocking the terrified children. Cassie stood up, moving gracefully, almost gliding. "Stay here," she commanded. She walked towards the source of the song, the children too paralyzed with fear to protest. As she climbed the staircase, the song's volume decreased until it was barely audible. Reaching the top, she paused outside a door, which, until that moment, the children didn't know existed. She entered the room, and the door slammed shut behind her. Silence reigned. After what felt like hours, but was only minutes, Cassie emerged. The lullaby had ceased. The atmosphere felt lighter, less oppressive. Returning to the living room, she found the children huddled together, eyes wide with terror. She sighed, "It's okay now." Samara, her voice shaking, managed to ask, "What was that?" Cassie hesitated before answering. Sometimes, old houses have stories. And sometimes, those stories demand to be heard. Luigi buried his face in Samara's shoulder, whimpering. Franklin, though visibly shaken, put on a brave face. "That was some trick," he muttered. Cassie just smiled, the same enigmatic smile she had when she first entered Los Ranchos. But this time, it held a hint of sadness. The night wore on. With the children finally asleep, Cassie sat in the dimly lit living room, listening to the silence. If one looked closely, they'd see a lone tear trickle down her cheek. The entity within her, awakened, was restless. And this was just the beginning. Chapter 3. Unraveling reality. Morning light had not yet graced the Wentworth home, but an underlying tension was palpable. The events of the previous night left an indelible mark on the children, a shadow that loomed large as the day began. Franklin, with a simmering rage, confronted Cassie during breakfast. "What game are you playing? What kind of sick joke was last night?" Cassie, taking a sip of her tea, looked at him calmly, but the atmosphere crackled with a palpable electric charge. "I told you, old houses have stories." But Franklin wasn't having it. "Bull. I've lived here my entire life, and never experienced, whatever that was." Samara interjected, her voice shaky. "Frankie, please." Franklin's anger continued to boil over. "I'm 15, for God's sake. I don't need a babysitter, especially one as freaky as you." He stood up, pointing an accusatory finger at Cassie. "I'm going to tell Mom and Dad about your little stunt. You won't be setting foot in this house again." As he spoke, the atmosphere in the room thickened. The lights dimmed, and the room's temperature plummeted. Cassie's eyes darkened, her face becoming a mask of cold rage. For a split second, another figure overlapped hers, a monstrous, shadowy form with burning eyes. The entity. Luigi screamed, dropping his cereal bowl, the milk spilling like a trail of white blood. Samara clutched the table's edge so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The entity spoke, its voice an unearthly growl that resonated with malevolence. "You would do well to watch your tone, boy. Or you'll find out what true fear feels like." Franklin, though defiant and full of teenage bravado, couldn't hide the terror in his eyes. He took a step back, bumping into the dining chair. Cassie, or the being controlling her, advanced slowly, the room's shadows dancing around her, elongating, becoming more menacing. Do you think this is a game? Do you think you can threaten me? Suddenly, with a gust of wind that seemed to originate from nowhere, Franklin was lifted off the ground, pinned against the wall. He struggled, gasping for breath, his eyes darting frantically. Samara, tears streaming down her face, begged, "Please. Stop. Let him go." The entity, taking perverse pleasure in the display of its power, grinned, a grotesque, twisted smile that didn't belong on Cassie's face. After what felt like an eternity, it dropped Franklin. He crumpled to the ground, gasping for air, terror evident in every ragged breath. But then, as suddenly as it had manifested, the entity retreated. Cassie collapsed, her energy drained. The room returned to its previous state, sunlight filtering in, but the chilling events left a permanent frost. Luigi, tears streaming down his face, ran to Franklin, wrapping his tiny arms around his elder brother. The bond between siblings never felt stronger. Samara, her voice shaky, whispered, "What is happening?" Franklin, regaining some semblance of composure, looked at Cassie, a mixture of anger and fear in his eyes. "What are you?" Cassie, visibly shaken and trying to gather herself, responded, "It's not what I am, it's what's inside me." A heavy silence enveloped the room. The entity's demonstration of power left the children traumatized, questioning their reality. "I didn't ask for this," Cassie murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "But it chose me." The morning's events marked a turning point. The balance of power had shifted. The entity, having shown a glimpse of its terrifying capabilities, lay dormant, but its threat loomed large. Throughout the day, the children remained on edge, the trauma of the morning's events casting a shadow over even the simplest of activities. Whispers and worried glances were exchanged, with all three siblings forming a united front, trying to make sense of their twisted reality. As night approached, the fear heightened. The Wentworth home, once a haven, now felt like a sinister trap, its walls holding memories of the terror that had unfolded. As the children huddled in Samara's room, a united front against the unknown horrors, they realized one thing. They were in this together, and together, they would face whatever lay ahead. But the entity had other plans. Its taste of dominance left it craving more, and the night was long. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it whispers of events yet to unfold. The Wentworth house stood silent, its windows reflecting the moon's pale light, hiding the secrets and terrors within. Chapter 4. Pleas and dismissals. Francine Wentworth was already deep into her latest novel when her children, all three of them, burst into the living room. Their faces were a chaotic blend of horror, anxiety, and pleading urgency. "Mom, Dad!" Samara cried, the usually calm and collected 9-year-old's voice shaking. "You have to listen to us." Thomas looked up from his paperwork, annoyance flashing across his features. "What on earth?" One at a time. Franklin, taking the lead, tried to suppress the tremble in his voice. "We can't have Cassie babysit again. Ever." Francine raised an eyebrow, glancing toward the gentle young woman she'd met and grown to trust. "Why?" "She's been nothing but professional. Your father and I felt at ease with her." "Mom, she's not what she seems." Luigi, the youngest, piped up, gripping his toy truck like a lifeline. "There's something inside her." Samara nodded vehemently, adding, "Last night, Frankie was lifted off the ground by something. Something that came out of Cassie." Francine exchanged a skeptical look with Thomas. "Samara, we've told you about making up stories." This isn't like one of your books. Dad, it's not a lie. Franklin exclaimed, his voice strained. It threatened me. It threatened us. It's powerful, whatever it is. Thomas rubbed his temples, shooting his wife a tired glance. Look, it's natural to feel unsettled after a new babysitter. But these wild accusations aren't fair to Cassie. But Dad, Samara cried. No buts, Francine interjected, voice firm. Your father and I trust Cassie. She's mature, responsible, and comes highly recommended. That evening, as the children sat in their rooms, a whispering wind snaked its way through the cracks and crevices of the old Wentworth house. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing a sinister promise. You can't escape. The next time, you'll witness chaos like never before. Samara, lying in bed, felt the cold wind wrap around her, the message clear. She remembered the horror in Cassie's eyes, or rather, the entity's eyes. Tears pricked her eyes, and she pulled the blanket close, hoping for some semblance of protection. In the next room, Franklin lay with his eyes wide open, fists clenched. He knew they had to find a way to avoid another night with Cassie, but how? The whispers echoed in his ears, a chilling reminder of the entity's power. Luigi, clutching his toy truck, whispered into the darkness, "Go away," as if hoping the entity would heed his plea. The next morning, over breakfast, the children huddled together, formulating a plan. We could stay at Grandma's, Luigi suggested, eyes wide with hope. Franklin shook his head. She's out of town. Besides, Mom and Dad would ask questions. Samara pondered for a moment. What if we get evidence? Record whatever happens. We could show Mom and Dad, and they'd have to believe us. Franklin frowned, considering the proposal. It's risky, but it might be our only shot. We need to be prepared. The following days saw the Wentworth children preparing for their plan. They gathered old phones, setting them up in various parts of the house. Samara even managed to dig up an old voice recorder, placing it strategically in the living room. Every time Cassie visited, the children felt the temperature drop, an eerie atmosphere enveloping the house. Even when she smiled, there was something off, a glint in her eyes that betrayed the entity lurking within. One evening, as Francine and Thomas announced another night out, leaving Cassie in charge, the children braced themselves. The stage was set. They had one shot at capturing evidence. Remember, stick together, Franklin whispered as their parents left, Cassie watching them with an unreadable expression. As the night wore on, the usual happenings started, flickering lights, cold breezes, and the undeniable feeling of being watched. At one point, a soft lullaby floated through the house, a twisted version of a childhood favorite. The source? Unclear. Hours felt like days. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind had the children on edge. And then, just as they started to think they might be safe, the entity struck. Furniture levitated, shadows danced menacingly, and a high-pitched laughter echoed through the house. The cameras and voice recorder captured it all, each moment more terrifying than the last. By the time dawn approached, the entity retreated, leaving the children exhausted but with evidence in hand. They were ready to confront their parents, ready to show them the horror they had endured. As morning rays streamed into the Wentworth house, a new day dawned. But for the children, it was more than just a day. It was a day of reckoning, a day where they hoped their pleas wouldn't be dismissed any longer. Chapter 5. A night to remember. The Wentworth home had a different energy on the evening of the company party. Everywhere you looked, The remnants of the daily hustle-bustle were evident. Francine's dress hanging meticulously on the closet door, the scent of Thomas's cologne still lingering in the air, and a hint of excitement, blended with a generous dose of apprehension. The children exchanged weary glances as they heard the familiar sound of the doorbell. Cassie's arrival was always punctuated with a chill, a sudden drop in the temperature that made your skin crawl. And tonight was no exception. "Hi there," she chirped, her voice saccharine sweet, yet to the children, it seemed just a tad too forced. Franklin gave a tight-lipped smile. "Evening, Cassie." Samara and Luigi, avoiding direct eye contact, mumbled their greetings. The house, in stark contrast to its usual warmth, felt different tonight. The oppressive atmosphere was palpable. Even the family cat, Whiskers, seemed on edge, darting from one corner of the room to another, as if being chased by an unseen entity. The initial hours passed without much incident. Dinner was served, a movie was watched, and the children had almost convinced themselves that tonight might be different. Maybe the entity was dormant. Maybe it had moved on. But as the clock neared midnight, that false sense of security was shattered. The first sign was the lights. The living room, illuminated by a soft glow moments ago, plunged into darkness. The only source of light now was the cold blue hue emanating from the TV screen. But even that started to flicker, showcasing scenes that weren't part of the movie they were watching: tormented faces, eerie landscapes, and shadowy figures. Next was the sound. The comforting hum of the refrigerator was replaced by a haunting melody. The lyrics, though indistinct, carried a menacing undertone. "Can you hear that?" whispered Luigi, his tiny fingers gripping Samara's hand. Before she could answer, the entire room began to vibrate. Picture frames rattled, furniture shifted, and an invisible force seemed to grip the very foundations of the house. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house as the back door flew open. In the doorway stood Cassie, or at least the silhouette of her, backlit by an otherworldly red glow. But it wasn't just her. Behind her, a series of shadows danced, moving with an erratic, jittery motion. Franklin, realizing the direness of the situation, yelled, "Luigi, Samara, upstairs." Now. Samara grabbed her younger brother, racing up the staircase, while Franklin tried to distract the entity. But the entity was no longer interested in just the Wentworth children. It wanted more. Next door, Mrs. Robinson, an elderly woman known for her insatiable curiosity, was drawn to her window by the commotion. Peering through the blinds, her eyes widened in horror. The sight of Cassie, surrounded by the shadowy figures, was terrifying enough. But what chilled her to the bone was when one of the figures turned to look directly at her, its eyes glowing a fierce yellow. She wasn't the only one. Multiple neighbors, drawn to their windows by the cacophony, bore witness to the chilling scene playing out in the Wentworth residence. Across the street, the Millers watched in abject terror as their living room was bathed in the red glow emanating from the Wentworth house. Young Timmy Miller, holding his teddy bear, whispered, "Mommy, why are the shadows moving?" Mrs. Miller, pulling him close, whispered back, "Stay away from the windows." Back at the Wentworth home, Franklin had managed to barricade himself and his siblings in their parents' bedroom. The once safe haven, however, now felt like a trap. Whispers echoed through the air vents, carrying threats of unspeakable horrors. The temperature dropped so suddenly that their breaths materialized in front of them. "We need to stick together," Franklin urged, his voice barely above a whisper. Hours seemed like days, and with each passing minute, the intensity of the entity's assault amplified. But as dawn approached, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The red glow receded, the whispers faded, and the Wentworth home, once a scene of unbridled chaos, returned to its normal state. But the scars of the night would remain. Not just on the Wentworth children, but on the entire neighborhood. They had borne witness to a force beyond comprehension, an entity whose motives remained a mystery. The morning sun may have heralded a new day, but for the residents of this quaint Albuquerque neighborhood, life as they knew it had changed forever. The events of that night would become the stuff of legends, passed down from one generation to the next, a haunting reminder of the night when the very fabric of reality unraveled. Chapter 6. Desperate measures. The aftermath of that terrifying night left the Wentworth children in a state of heightened alertness. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of the leaves, every shadow cast on the wall was met with suspicion and dread. But as the days trudged along, that pervasive fear transformed into a resolute determination. "We need a plan," declared Franklin, his voice steady, belying the fear that still lingered in his heart. The eldest of the siblings had naturally assumed the role of the protector, and it was a role he took seriously. Luigi, clutching a worn-out teddy bear, nodded. "We can't let it win." Samara, usually the more pragmatic of the three, had spent days researching the paranormal. Entities like these usually have an anchor, something or someone that tethers them to our realm. We find it, we break its hold. Their initial attempts at combating the entity were rudimentary at best. Salt circles, chanting of prayers, and even burning sage. But each attempt was met with violent retaliation. Walls would ooze with a dark, viscous substance. Doors would slam shut on their own. Even their trusted cat, Whiskers, seemed possessed at times, his eyes glowing an unnatural shade of green. The Wentworth's neighbors, having witnessed the horrors of that night, could no longer stay silent. Led by Mr. Reynolds, a stout, middle-aged man with a penchant for community service, they decided to stage an intervention. "We've seen enough horror movies to know where this is heading," he stated, trying to inject a bit of levity into an otherwise grim situation. "We need to help." But the entity wasn't one to be trifled with. As the neighbors approached the Wentworth residence, a chilling wind picked up. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sky darkened, clouds rolling in at an alarming pace. Mrs. Patterson, a frail elderly woman, was the first to feel the entity's wrath. She was lifted off her feet, suspended in the air for what felt like an eternity, before being violently thrown against the Wentworth's white picket fence. Panicking, the neighbors tried to retreat, but an invisible barrier prevented their escape. They were trapped. The house itself transformed into a living, breathing entity. Windows shattered, spewing shards of glass in every direction. The front door, previously inviting, now resembled the gaping maw of some ancient beast, ready to devour any who dared to approach. Inside the house, the Wentworth children could only watch in horror. Their sanctuary had become a battlefield, a ground zero for supernatural occurrences that defied all logic and reason. In the midst of the chaos, Samara stumbled upon a diary. It was old, its pages yellowed with age. The name, Eleanor Wentworth, was inscribed on the first page. As she skimmed through the entries, a realization dawned on her. Eleanor Wentworth, their great-great-grandmother, had also encountered the entity. And she had found a way to temporarily subdue it. "There's a pendant," Samara yelled over the deafening roar of the chaos. "A family heirloom. It has the power to bind the entity." The diary mentioned the pendant being hidden in the attic, protected by a series of traps to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. The journey to the attic was fraught with peril. The entity, sensing the threat the pendant posed, threw everything in its path to stop them. But the siblings were undeterred. They navigated the labyrinthine hallways, dodged the ever-shifting traps, and finally found the pendant. It was beautiful, a silver locket with an intricate carving of a tree, its branches resembling the veins of a heart. As Samara clasped the pendant, a blinding light emanated from it, enveloping the entire house. The entity let out an ear-piercing scream, a sound of pure agony and rage. The neighbors, previously trapped, found themselves freed from the entity's hold. The dark clouds receded, replaced by the soft glow of the setting sun. The house, however, bore the scars of the battle. Walls were charred, windows broken, and the once pristine lawn was now a barren wasteland. But in the midst of the destruction, there was hope. The Wentworth children, armed with the knowledge of their ancestor, had found a way to fight back. The entity may not have been vanquished, but it was weakened. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the neighborhood in a soft orange hue, the residents of Albuquerque knew that the battle was far from over. But for the first time in weeks, they dared to hope. They had witnessed the power of unity, of community, and they were ready for whatever lay ahead. Chapter 7. Power play. Franklin's heart raced, his fingers tightening around the pendant. The soft hum of its power vibrated against his palm, a reminder of the entity's newfound vulnerability. "We've got an upper hand now," he whispered to himself, mustering the courage to face the lurking malevolence. Trepidation lined Samara's features, but her voice held an unwavering strength. "Luigi and I will handle the containment ritual. Franklin, remember, you're the bait, not the hero. We need to lure it and trap it, not engage in a direct fight." Franklin nodded. "I understand." The initial steps of their strategy had been clear. With the entity's weakness revealed, Franklin would draw its attention, acting as a distraction, while Samara and Luigi readied an intricate containment spell they had discovered amongst Eleanor Wentworth's old manuscripts. Wearing the pendant, Franklin ventured into the main hall. He could feel the shift in the air, a drop in temperature, a silent pressure pressing against him. The once familiar surroundings took on a more sinister edge, the darkness seemingly thicker, clinging to every nook and corner. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice echoing. "We've had enough of you. Why don't you pick on someone your own size?" A gust of wind blew through the hallway, extinguishing the candles lining the walls. In the flickering darkness, a shape began to form. The entity, a swirling mass of shadow, materialized, its shape constantly changing, from humanoid to something altogether alien. Its eyes, however, remained constant, two burning red orbs that seared with hatred. The sight was chilling, but Franklin stood his ground. "This ends now," he declared, holding up the pendant. The entity recoiled slightly, its form quivering. The power of the pendant was undeniable. In the background, Luigi and Samara began chanting in unison. The air crackled with energy, the very walls vibrating in response. They were drawing upon ancient powers, laying down a containment circle lined with salt and crystals. However, the entity wasn't about to be easily defeated. It sensed the impending danger and lashed out. Its rage was palpable, the atmosphere charged with malevolence. Furniture flew through the air, paintings tore off the walls, and the very foundations of the house shook. The magnitude of its power was unprecedented, the destruction unparalleled. Yet, amid the chaos, a new presence made itself known. A frail figure, dressed in old, tattered clothing, stepped out from the shadows. The mysterious old neighbor, Mr. Whitman, whom the children had only seen a handful of times, his home shrouded in tall trees and overgrown vegetation. "Children," he called out, his voice surprisingly strong, "there's another way." The siblings glanced at each other, uncertainty evident in their eyes. They had always found Mr. Whitman peculiar, but now wasn't the time for doubt. Every passing second meant more devastation, more terror. "We're listening," Samara shouted above the roar of the tempest the entity was conjuring. Mr. Whitman swiftly approached the trio, producing a vial filled with a luminescent liquid. "This is the essence of ether," he explained hurriedly. "Derived from the ancient elements, it can amplify your pendant's power." Franklin, grasping the gravity of the situation, accepted the vial and uncapped it. The liquid inside shimmered and glowed, casting an ethereal light. He poured it over the pendant, which absorbed it instantly, radiating a blinding brilliance. "Focus," Mr. Whitman instructed. "Channel your intent. Bind it." With newfound determination, Franklin held the pendant high, drawing the entity's full attention. The force of the pendant's power was overwhelming. The entity writhed and shrieked, its form collapsing in on itself, struggling against the strength of the combined Wentworth legacy and the essence of ether. Samara and Luigi redoubled their efforts, their chant rising to a feverish pitch. The containment circle pulsed, then flared, casting a net of light over the entity. The struggle was intense, the balance constantly shifting, but slowly, the entity began to compress, its vast form being pushed into the containment circle. With one final, desperate scream, the entity was trapped, bound within the intricate designs of the containment spell. The house, battered and bruised, settled into an uneasy silence. The immediate threat had been subdued, but the aura of unease lingered. Mr. Whitman, his role now clear, nodded at the children. "It's contained, but not defeated. Remember, every prison has its limits." Samara approached the old man, gratitude evident in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Whitman. But why help us?" He smiled, a weary yet kind expression. "Your great-great-grandmother, Eleanor, was a dear friend. I owed her much in our younger days. It was time to repay that debt." With that cryptic remark, the elderly neighbor retreated to his secluded abode, leaving behind a plethora of questions and a world forever changed by supernatural forces. The Wentworth children, victorious but exhausted, knew their battle was far from over. They had faced the entity and survived, but the true journey to understand and perhaps free themselves from this malevolent force had only just begun. Chapter 8. The final hour moonlight filtered through the shattered windows of the Wentworth residence, its silvery beams casting eerie shadows. The earlier confrontation with the entity left the once grand mansion in ruins, with shattered porcelain and torn drapes littering the floors. But as the clock's hand inched closer to midnight, the children knew the true battle lay ahead. Huddled around a large wooden table, Franklin, Samara, and Luigi examined the array of arcane tools and manuscripts spread before them. They had one chance, one final gambit to rid their home, and Cassie, of the malevolent entity that plagued them. "We have the knowledge," Samara murmured, her fingers tracing an old diagram in Eleanor Wentworth's diary, "but we need a plan." Luigi, usually the quietest of the trio, spoke up, determination burning in his eyes. "We've seen its power, its fury. But it's bound to Cassie, drawing strength from her. We need to separate them." Franklin nodded in agreement, gripping the pendant that had once repelled the entity. "This is our weapon, but it's not enough on its own. We need something more, a ritual perhaps, to banish the entity for good. As the siblings brainstormed, the atmosphere grew tense. A chilling draft crept in, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. The house groaned, and from the depths of its corridors, a faint whisper echoed, a mocking, haunting laughter. The entity was aware of their intent. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness, the soft glow of the candles snuffed out. The temperature dropped sharply, and an oppressive weight settled upon them, a stark reminder of the entity's overwhelming power. From the shadows, a figure emerged. Cassie, or the malevolent force that now controlled her, stepped into the dim light. Her once warm eyes now glowed a fiery red, her features twisted in a grotesque snarl. "You think you can defeat me?" No, it hissed, her voice a chorus of agony and rage. "I've existed for eons, feeding on fear, thriving on despair." Without warning, the entity lunged at them, propelling furniture and artifacts in every direction. The children dodged and weaved, desperately trying to evade the storm of destruction. Samara began to chant, her voice rising above the cacophony, trying to restrain the entity. But every attempt was met with more resistance, more fury. The once grand living room became an epicenter of chaos. Walls cracked and paintings flew off their moorings. Luigi, clutching an old staff from Eleanor's collection, deftly deflected incoming debris, while Franklin brandished the pendant, its glow serving as a beacon amidst the darkness. Drawing strength from one another, the siblings combined their efforts. Samara's chant, a call to the old forces that guarded their lineage, resonated through the house. The pendant, infused with the essence of ether, emitted a brilliant light, casting a web that began to ensnare the entity. The battle raged on, every corner of the room bearing witness to the struggle between ancient evil and a family's enduring spirit. But as dawn's first light began to pierce the horizon, a shift occurred. The entity, writhing in agony, was being pulled away from Cassie, its form unraveling, disintegrating. Yet, in a last desperate act, it lunged at Franklin, trying to wrest the pendant from his grasp. But the combined might of the Wentworth legacy and the rising sun proved too much. With a scream that echoed through the very fabric of time, the entity was expelled, momentarily defeated, leaving behind a shell-shocked Cassie, who collapsed into unconsciousness. The first rays of morning painted the room in gold, revealing the aftermath of the night's horrors. The house, once a symbol of elegance and grace, now bore the scars of the confrontation, walls marred, furniture destroyed, memories tainted. Yet amidst the devastation, there was a palpable sense of relief. The entity, while not completely vanquished, had retreated, granting the Wentworths a momentary respite. The children, exhausted yet triumphant, huddled around Cassie, who slowly stirred. Confusion clouded her eyes, memories of her possession fragmented and distant. The weight of their ordeal was evident on their young faces, but their bond, their unity, had seen them through the darkest of hours. Morning had arrived, bringing with it a new day, a new hope. But as the Wentworth children gazed upon their ravaged home, they knew their journey was far from over. The entity may have been defeated, but the battle for their souls, and Cassie's redemption, had only just begun. The echoes of the entity's rage, its promise of return, lingered in the air, a chilling reminder that true evil never rests, it merely waits. Chapter 9. Aftermath. The Wentworth driveway was filled with Francine and Thomas's car, alongside two others from the local police. The crunch of gravel under tire seemed almost sacrilegious in the hush that had settled over the battered Wentworth home. As the car doors opened, the cold morning air carried with it the sound of distant sirens and a pervasive sense of dread. Francine stepped out first, her heels sinking slightly into the ground, moistened by the earlier morning dew. The scene before her was like an abstract painting of chaos, windows shattered, the front door ajar, and the remnants of the battle scattered everywhere. "Thomas," she whispered, gripping his arm, her other hand instinctively reaching for her pearls. "What happened here?" Thomas, normally the stoic one, could barely find the words. He felt a pang of guilt for having dismissed his children's fears so easily before. I don't know," he stammered. "But we need to find the kids." Rushing inside, their worst fears seemed to be confirmed by the destruction around them. The once immaculate living room was a testament to the terror of the night before. Furniture overturned, walls cracked, and even the chandelier hung skewed, shards of its crystal littering the floor below. Francine's frantic calls for her children echoed through the house until a soft murmur led them to the conservatory. There, under the large, arched window, sat Franklin, Luigi, and Samara, huddled together, with Cassie a few feet away, seemingly in a daze. The relief was palpable, a momentary respite from the nightmare. The kids looked up, their faces a mix of relief, exhaustion, and something darker. "Mama," Samara whispered, tears filling her eyes. Francine rushed to them, enveloping them in an embrace, while Thomas tried to approach Cassie. "Cassie?" he asked tentatively. "Are you all right?" Cassie blinked, her once vibrant eyes now vacant. I don't remember," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just woke up." As the police began their examination of the house, the children recounted the horrors of the night before. At first, their story was met with skeptical glances. After all, tales of malevolent entities and supernatural battles were hard to believe. But the physical evidence was undeniable. The house bore the scars of something inexplicable. When the children showed the pendant, which had played a crucial role in the entity's temporary defeat, one of the older officers, Officer Harrington, paled. "I've seen this," he murmured, his voice carrying memories of old-town tales filled with whispers of dark forces and brave families. The morning wore on, and as the sun rose higher, a decision was made. Cassie, visibly shaken and with no memory of her actions, was escorted away from the Wentworth residence. As she stepped into the awaiting car, she turned, her eyes meeting Samara's. There was a moment, a fleeting second, where something passed between them, a mix of regret, understanding, and a promise of a battle yet to come. In the days that followed, the Wentworth home became the talk of the town. Neighbors whispered, children traded tales, and the local newspaper carried a front-page story of the mysterious happenings at the Wentworth estate. The community, once peaceful and idyllic, now lived in fear. The entity, though defeated, had not been vanquished, and the looming threat of its return cast a shadow over the town. Playdates were canceled, evening walks ceased, and an unspoken curfew descended upon the community. Francine and Thomas, having witnessed the aftermath, no longer doubted their children. They took steps to fortify their home, consulting with local historians and paranormal experts, searching for a permanent solution. Eleanor's diary became a constant reference, a beacon in their quest to understand and ultimately defeat the dark force that sought to destroy their family. The Wentworth children, having faced the unimaginable, grew closer than ever. Their bond, forged in the crucible of terror, became unbreakable. They knew that the battle was far from over, that the entity, wherever it was, would return. As the days turned to weeks, a semblance of normalcy began to return. But beneath the surface, the tension remained, a ticking time bomb awaiting the entity's inevitable return. The Wentworths, and the town at large, braced themselves, knowing that the next confrontation was not a matter of if, but when. In the quiet moments, as night descended, and shadows played on the walls of the Wentworth home, a soft whisper could be heard, a promise of revenge, a vow of return, an assurance that the true battle for the souls of Albuquerque was only just beginning. Chapter 10. The looming shadow Los Ranchos, with its tree-lined streets and perfectly manicured lawns, was once the epitome of suburban tranquility. Now, it bore the weight of an unspeakable secret that hung in the air like a dense fog, refusing to lift. The children playing in the parks, once boisterous and carefree, were more guarded, their laughter stifled. Parents whispered to each other at school gates and supermarket aisles, their discussions invariably circling back to the Wentworth house. In the diner downtown, where gossipy waitresses once discussed the latest love affairs and minor neighborhood squabbles, the conversations had turned darker. Rumors of the entity, its terrifying power, its intentions, were shared, embellished, and passed around like a secret currency. "I heard it wasn't just the Wentworth home," Mrs. Thompson, the town librarian, whispered across the counter to Joan, the diner's longtime waitress. "My cousin from the next town over said they've had disturbances too. Doors slamming, lights flickering. It's like a wave of evil sweeping through." Joan shuddered. "It's the Wentworth babysitter. She brought it here. Ever since she stepped into town, things haven't been the same." And that was the million-dollar question on everyone's lips. Where was Cassie? She had seemingly vanished into thin air, her whereabouts unknown. The local police had conducted a search but came up empty-handed. Some said she had gone back to wherever she came from. Others believed she was hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Meanwhile, the Wentworths struggled to regain some sense of normalcy. Francine took a leave of absence from work, dedicating her time to piecing her family's life back together. Thomas dove deep into the historical records of Los Ranchos, searching for clues or patterns that might help them better understand the entity that had wreaked havoc on their lives. And the Wentworth children? They were changed. The innocence of youth had been ripped away, replaced by a maturity and wariness that came from facing the unimaginable. They rarely ventured out, and when they did, they were met with a mix of sympathy and fear from their peers. One evening, as the sun cast long shadows over Los Ranchos, Franklin sat on the porch of the Wentworth home, the diary of Eleanor, the mysterious old neighbor who had hinted at a solution, resting on his lap. He flipped through the pages, stopping at a passage that read, "Entities, once awakened, are seldom alone. Where one steps forth, others are bound to follow." A cold chill ran down his spine. Could there be others? Across town, in a house that had long stood abandoned, a soft light flickered in an upstairs window. Inside, a group had gathered, their faces hidden in the shadows. Candles were lit in a circle, and in the center, a photo of Cassie lay surrounded by symbols unfamiliar to the average eye but deeply significant to those who understood. "We call upon the spirits of old, the entities of darkness, to rise," intoned a voice, its timbre deep and resonant. "Los Ranchos shall be the epicenter, and from here, we shall spread, reclaiming what was once ours." And as the chant grew in volume, another entity, darker and more powerful than the one the Wentworths had encountered, began to emerge. Back at the Wentworth home, Samara, who had the gift of sensing shifts in the spiritual realm, felt a sudden drop in temperature. She looked out of the window, her gaze drawn to the abandoned house in the distance. A sense of foreboding settled in her heart. "They're not done with us," she whispered to herself. "It's just the beginning." And as Los Ranchos settled into another night, the shadows grew longer, the whispers louder, and the sense of impending doom more palpable. The battle for the soul of the town was far from over. And the stage was set for a confrontation more epic, more terrifying than anything they had witnessed before. In the heart of tranquility, darkness stirs. Los Ranchos will never be the same again. We hope you have enjoyed our storytelling offering tonight. Please be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to be alerted of future weekly additions to our collections. Paranormal Untold Stories.